Hello and welcome to this edition of Age of Truth TV. I'm Lucas Alexander at the Open Mind Conference in Skanderborg, Denmark. I'm joined now today by Brien Foerster, Secret Ancient Civilizations. Brien Foerster, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's wonderful to have you here.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Please tell us about your life story, your work. How did you get into this field of studying ancient civilizations? What led you on that path? Why is it so important for you to actually study that and come out publicly and talk about it?
Well, basically, I grew up on the west coast of Canada, and when I was quite young, I became more interested in the native culture of the area than with the immigrant culture that I was part of. And so, as I was growing up, I learned how to carve totem poles and became very involved in native studies. And then after...
The Indians.
The Indian people, yeah.
Indian people.
And then after that, actually I was a professional sculptor and artist in the native tradition.
Really?
Taught by native people. And then when I was about 35, I moved to Hawaii and became involved with the Hawaiian culture because they were and are experiencing a renaissance of their culture. They've been suppressed by American and other forms of domination for a long time. So I became involved in a 2-year voyaging sailing canoe project of trying to rebuild or reconstruct a 60-foot ocean-going ship that could sail without any form of what we would call technology from Hawaii to Tahiti.
Some kind of Noah's Ark, almost, it sounds like
Yes.
A giant one? Or
Sort of, but it's known that the Hawaiians originally came from Tahiti. So what we were trying to do was to prove that the native people knew how to navigate over thousands of miles without the need of compasses or what we regard as being technology capable of allowing for long ocean-going travel. A rebirth of the ancient knowledge, because archaeologists and anthropologists to some degree thought that the Hawaiians accidentally made it to Hawaii because they were fishermen who got blown off course or something. But through the construction of the canoe, what we were trying to prove is that these people knew the ocean so well, and they knew nature so well, that they didn't need what in Western terms would be technological ability, as in having a compass, having a watch, having a sextant, and machines. It was more that they were able to use their minds and their observations of nature. So then I became involved in traveling through
an inner compass,
Polynesian.
really.
Basically, yeah. It's more the idea that ancient people knew how to use their minds to a fuller capacity than we do now, because we are actually dependent upon technology.
Yeah.
And that's what separates, in some kinds, in a racist way, that, some people think, well, we as Western people are more highly evolved because we've developed all of these machines and things, rather than having the capability of not needing them.
So you're actually talking about a spiritual thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a holistic way of approaching reality.
Like a sixth sense, or?
Just using a higher percentage of your mental ability, because you don't have these other things which you use as aids. You're dependent upon using your mind.
What are the key elements in your research?
Well, I would say since I first started going to Peru about 9 years ago, I started to see stone constructions which seem not to be capable of the Bronze Age culture called the Inca. They seem far too big, far too precise, and far too complex. And archaeologists insist that the Inca built these things, But having brought engineers down to Peru to look at them, they say no, they were incapable. So the question is, well, if they were incapable, and the Spanish who came later were also incapable in the 16th century, then who made them and how long ago are we looking at their time of construction?
Yeah, very fascinating. Are we talking like Lemuria or Atlantis or something like that? That it could possibly be something from these continents?
Well, I think Lemuria and Atlantis are both poetic terms for ancient cultures.
Really?
Yeah.
So they weren't like real continents, like huge, big continents that kind of were there way before the landmass we have today.
I don't believe so. I think, for example, having lived in Hawaii and having spoken to some of the Hawaiian elders and brought up the idea of Lemuria or Mu, what they say is that in the long distant past, 10,000 plus years ago, actually 12,000 years ago, the thing is that the ocean levels of the planet were 350 feet, or about 100 meters lower than they are today. So at that time, almost all of the Hawaiian Islands were connected. So they created or were one landmass, and that could have been what Mu or Lemuria actually was. But also the problem is that when you try to interpret Plato's story of Atlantis or native mythology, you can't read them in a linear way because they're written as poetry. And so you have to interpret what they're talking about. In the case of Atlantis, again, rather than there being a continent that sank, if again you think about 12,000 years ago, the ocean levels rose, that's a poetic way of saying that the land sunk.
How do we know for sure if the water sank? How do we know that?
There's a lot of scientific data about that, and mainly what it is that what we now know is that at the end of the Ice Age, which was 12,000 years ago, it was not a slow and gradual event. It happened in spurts, and some of them were very rapid. There could have been either a comet that came close to the Earth or hit the Earth. It could have been asteroids or other phenomenon from space. And some scientists, and these are university scientists, state that it's quite possible that the oceans of the world rose by 350 feet in as short as 3 years. So any advanced civilization, of course, has a tendency to live by the water because they like to move. And so they would have been forced to move from where they were, in the case of Atlantis, and find other lands to inhabit.
So can we rely on what a university professor is saying officially?
Well, we can, because there are so many different disciplines that are backing the information up. And the time frame they're all talking about now, as far as I know, is about 11,700 years ago. This event happened.
But you're kind of speaking a little bit against the official stories about the ancient civilizations. You're talking a lot about the elongated skulls and giant races and advanced technologies even back then, way back, before the Egyptian culture as well, right?
Exactly.
What is the importance and the urgency to speak about these things and to do this research?
Well, the thing, again, is I believe that all of this ancient mythology is actually talking about reality, even the biblical flood. The timeline probably, again, they're probably describing the same event about 12,000 years ago. What seems to have happened is that because this catastrophe happened and it was so terrible that people went from a high state of consciousness and being and technology down to more or less being Stone Age people for at least a few thousand years. And so all of that knowledge was lost, and society had to reconstruct itself. And that's why in Egypt and Sumeria and India...
Which came after.
Exactly. It came thousands of years after. It was a reconstruction.
Thousands of years after.
Yes.
Interesting, though.
Yeah. And so you have a rebuilding of civilization, but most academics think, no, that we started as hunter-gatherers and progressed in an almost linear progressive fashion, whereas it seems much more likely that over the course of several thousand years, we've been going through cycles because the Earth is not as stable as some wish to believe. An event like that 12,000 years ago could have destroyed much of the knowledge of humanity, and it had to be relearned, but the legends came with us. And rather than mocking them as being fairy tales, I think they're telling the truth. It's just they have to be interpreted in the right way, and they have to be backed up by scientific evidence.
And they were possibly technologically advanced, highly advanced, more so than today, or what would you say?
Well, differently than today, I think is the point, because all that's left behind are the stone constructions.
What did you find in your research? You went to these places, right, and visited.
Yeah, I live in Peru because...
So you have it in your backyard.
Well, literally, I can look out the window and see some of these. But I think
Really?
I think we're looking mainly at Peru, Bolivia, and Egypt as being the obvious examples.
Have you been a lot to Egypt as well?
I was just there in April.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you seen any changes over the years, or is it the same? I mean, the structures is the same. Have you found something new about the ancient Egyptian civilization?
Well, what I've been able to find out, because I've been working with so-called alternative students of the area, including people who know the oral ancient traditions, is that, for example, the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid complex on Giza are thousands of years older than the actual Egyptian culture, that the pharaohs, when they entered into the area about 5,000, more or less 5,000 years ago, those buildings were there. And of course, what they did is they would use the buildings and reinterpret them.
So they had nothing to do with the ancient pharaohs as we know it, as we like history tells us.
Exactly. No,
the pyramid and the Sphinx.
Yeah, they were not constructed by them. And again, there is a lot of developing scientific evidence that can support, what
Who
that
made
theory
them
is.
then? A lot of people say that it might be extraterrestrial help or UFO involvement in some kind of way. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, some people say that, but I prefer to go to the human solution first.
All right.
And what they speak about in Egypt is there was a culture thousands of years before the pharaohs called the Cometians. And actually, Kemet is the ancient name for Egypt, which means the black land. And that refers to the soil that the Nile produces. But after this catastrophic event, the Cometian civilization was more or less wiped out. Those that survived had to leave the area and spread out to different parts of the world. And then, thousands of years later, the pharaohs, or pharaonic people, enter the area, they occupy it, they build their civilization, they build structures all around these other ones, and so they blended in with what was there. And I think that's the mistake, though, because a lot of Egyptologists say, no, the Egyptians built everything.
Yeah.
The problem is, and that's why we bring engineers, is that the Egyptians were a Bronze Age culture.
Right.
And some of the stone that was worked is far harder than what bronze is. And so the engineers tell me, and the geologists say, that the Egyptians with bronze tools could not have achieved the size and the level of sophistication that we see.
Yeah, they're enormous structures. It's almost unbelievable to think that human beings could actually do that unless they were really technologically advanced.
Exactly, and the mistake, of course, again, is where they say, well, they had slaves, they had 10,000 or 100,000 slaves doing it, but the precision of the building would require someone who was an absolute master of the appropriate technology. So you're not going to be able to get 100,000 slaves to do that kind of precision. Because,
so could human beings even have done that, if we think realistically about it?
Well, Christopher Dunn, who was an engineer who wrote a book called The Giza Power Plant, he says in modern times we could reconstruct the Great Pyramid. However, the amount of effort and the cost would be incredibly huge. So what would be the purpose of it? The Great Pyramid is 500 feet tall. It's made up of, each stone is multi-ton. There are 2,300,000 of them. So again, the idea that a pharaoh would say, I'm so important that I need a tomb of this size, build it for me, and getting a bunch of slaves to do it, it just doesn't make sense in terms of...
But wasn't it before the pharaohs, actually, you just said?
Well, exactly. I'm just saying the conventional story is
right.
That. But in terms of what Christopher Dunn and others believe is that actually the pyramids themselves, and not all of them, but the ones made out of precise stone, were actually power plants. They were electrical.
For what? Yeah, that's interesting what they were used
for producing electricity.
Really?
Yeah.
How could that be done?
Well, the amazing thing is that here at the Open Mind Conference, there are a number of people talking about alternative energy.
Right.
And so according to the tradition of the Cometian people, they said that actually water was channeled from the Nile underground below the Great, for example, the Great Pyramid. And there they had developed a process where water was able to be broken into hydrogen and oxygen. So you're talking about a giant hydrogen generating station.
Wow.
So theoretically, it is, from what we're seeing today, it is possible. And I think what people are looking at now in terms of alternative technology is the reinvention of something that existed in the distant past.
So could water be used for energy today?
It is. Actually, at this conference, we've seen that someone did develop a car or an automobile that operates on water, as well as someone in New Zealand developed a motorcycle that does that. So
that would compromise the whole oil, gas, coal, financial industry?
Yes, it would. But the thing is that it's, most people say it's quite silly that we're still dependent upon oil and coal and gas, because we've had that for, 100 years? We have the capabilities, theoretically, of going to the moon and beyond, and yet we're still using this primitive technology?
Yeah, the famous scientist Nikola Tesla supposedly invented or made it possible for us to have free energy.
Exactly, and I think, but again, I think Tesla was reinventing something. I think he knew secrets from the past and recreated a technology.
How do you think he got that information or had access to that information?
Well, that's difficult to say, but of course there have been societies called secret societies, which is a term that have carried ancient knowledge for a long time.
Like the Illuminati, is that what we're talking about?
Well, the Illuminati possibly, but different people who have maintained the ancient knowledge and kept it secret because it's so dangerous.
What secret societies are we talking about, basically, you think?
Well, there's the Egyptian school of mysticism, and they supposedly went, quote unquote, underground when the Greeks arrived, because when the Greeks conquered Egypt, these people in Egypt still had this ancient knowledge from thousands of years ago.
But that was also thousands of years ago. That's not secret societies of today, right? Or the last 100 years.
No, that's true, but there has been a lineage of that knowledge going from several thousand years ago all the way to this day. Oh. It's just now it's becoming more obvious how it's being used.
Is it like, well, I just said the Illuminati, but Freemasonry or something like that, where they teach these mysticism and all these things, this greater enlightenment awareness, or what?
Well, the thing is, if you had the knowledge of this level, it would be so incredibly powerful that you would keep it quiet. The same thing with the Masons, because the Masons originally were Masons.
Right.
They were the ones who built the cathedrals.
Bricklayers, huh?
Exactly, but they kept the knowledge to themselves because their knowledge, they were the only ones capable of building these buildings. So you would not release that to the public, because then other people would learn how to also build these structures. So you kept it within a secret society because you were basically protecting your job.
But how did bricklayers acquire this kind of information, the great information that had to be kept secret even to this day?
Well, it's a question of, it's a lineage of stonemasons. And if you have the most sophisticated knowledge of any form, you want to keep it within an enclosed society. And the knowledge of the Masons, for example, at least goes back to ancient Egypt, and has been kept
that far.
Oh, at least that far, yeah.
So how about, we just talked about Lemuria and Atlantis. Do you believe in those stories? Do you believe that they were continents that existed? Some truth and conspiracy researchers have said that Atlantis was extraterrestrial kind of humanoid populated continent, and that Lemuria was reptilian populated with reptilian humanoids. Have you heard anything about that in your research?
I've heard a lot of different stories about that. The trouble is we don't know because, again, I think the Hawaiian Island area was what we call Lemuria. Right. And that when the oceans rose, that's when you had the division into islands, which they are today. That would have caused displacement of a lot of people. They would have had to have moved to other places. And that's where Peru kind of fits in. And the same thing with the concept of Atlantis. Of course, they found structures underneath parts of the Gulf of Mexico and areas like that. They found paved roads and things like that. So those people as well, probably around the same time, would have had to have moved. Whether or not they were human exactly the way we are human is unknown, because the people who left probably would have been a reasonably small population. So they would have had to have mixed with other people. So their bloodline would have been, from their original bloodline, it would have been reduced over the course of thousands of years. Only genetic testing would be able to tell us.
Some researchers claim that they may have been genetically modified or cloned or something like, and mixed between DNA from humanoid, human-looking extraterrestrials and reptilian.
Right.
Which is the reason they say that we have a reptilian brain but looking kind of mammalian. So it brings me also to these amazing statues that you've brought here, because they don't look like your skull or mine.
Right.
They look a little bit different, I have to say, especially that one here. It looks quite amazing. It looks a little bit like what we've seen from Egypt, Nefertiti and pharaohs. And can you tell us a little bit about what these skulls represent?
Sure. This is an exact replica of a skull from Peru, and it's not one of the largest ones. It's just this is the only one so far that we've had a cast or a copy made from. But this has been basically quite a focus of my work, and there's a very obscure culture that lived on the coast of Peru called the Paracas, who died out 2,000 years ago. And their royal family all had elongated skulls.
Identical replica, huh? Here, we can see it properly. And it does kind of look human from the front, doesn't it? But the skull is different. So could this be like another civilization from a different planet, otherworldly, or is it human?
That we don't know, because actually DNA is being tested right now from them. This is, again, a small example. There are some which are much larger. And I've brought a number of doctors and nurses and dentists and other medical personnel to look at some of these skulls. The majority of them were the result of cranial deformation, which is where the skull was bound as a baby in order to make them grow.
Really? They could do that?
Oh yeah, you can, because a baby skull is very flexible.
Why would they want to do that? Even also, it could damage the brain, couldn't it, in some kind of way, or what?
It's unlikely that it would damage the brain because it was done as a slow process, but it was a global phenomenon about 2,000 years ago, most commonly. And the three characteristics, if you research any of the cultures that did this, and again, they were global, is that number one, it was only done to the members of the royal family. Number two, it was thought to be something which was of beauty, aesthetic, and made the children more intelligent. And the most important thing, which relates to, ancient mystery, is that this is what the ancestors looked like. They say generally in the cultures. So the deformation was done to copy someone who lived in the distant past.
Interesting. And they also look like that in Egypt at the time. We've seen that in Nefertiti, for example, and other pharaohs, haven't we? That kind of skull.
Well, we haven't seen the skull. We've seen this is
a hat.
Yeah, this is a representation of a member of the Akhenaten family. And from what I've heard, the story about Akhenaten, who was 18th dynasty, was that he was trying to bring back ancient knowledge from the very distant past. And so, for example, he, rather than having all of these different gods, which is what was the case at the time, he said, no, we have to return to the original idea, which is to worship one God. So some Egyptologists have misinterpreted the idea that he was the first of the monotheistic rulers, that he thought of the idea of worshiping the sun. He was in fact bringing back very ancient knowledge and said, we want to reintroduce this. And so I think the artwork, again, is what his interpretation was of what his very ancient ancestors looked like. We've never found his skeleton, so we don't know what he looked like, but I think it's an artistic interpretation, for example, of Osiris, who is here. And Osiris is, most people believe is a mythological character, but I honestly believe that Osiris...
And a god, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Mentioned as a god.
Exactly. Well, he was treated as a god.
Yeah.
But I think he was a very ancient person or being, and he physically looked different. Because again, mythology in general is always based on some kind of fact, though the majority of academics say, no, these people just made up a story. But in culture after culture that I've been involved in, there's always fact involved in the very distant, history, including the idea of the biblical flood. We now know that it happened, but what it was the end of the Ice Age.
So the Bible, is that more symbolic?
Again, I think there's fact in it, but the flood, I believe, was a natural event caused by, again, a comet or asteroids or some other kind of disturbance. It wasn't a vengeful God killing his children. It's been interpreted as that long after the event happened, and that's the problem. When you go from an actual event through the course of hundreds and then thousands of years, a story will become reinterpreted, and then it becomes 1% of truth, when in the distant past it was 100% truth.
So what is your take generally on religion and religions and Christianity and, God as a figure, as a human-like figure?
I think that organized religion, honestly, is dangerous, because there's a very, very big difference between spirituality and religion. Religion is to some degree a set group of rules to live by, where spirituality...
You think it's used for control?
Very much so. I mean, to this day, very much so.
Why do you think people still keep on, believing in it, since we have such advanced, or supposedly advanced technology, of today at least?
Well, I think, to some degree it's a tradition within families or people.
Upbringing?
Yeah, how your upbringing was. Some people feel very comfortable being part of a religion, and I have, no personal problem with someone having a belief system. It's when they impose it on someone else. That's when it always becomes dangerous, when somebody says that, you have to be a Christian in order to live a good life and go to heaven or whatever. It's like, no, you live that way and leave me my sovereignty to believe what I believe. And I think there are universal principles of human conduct. Everyone knows that it's bad to steal, it's bad to murder, etc. I think we're genetically...
So it's basically made to create a set of rules.
Yeah, a set of rules
to keep people in line.
Well, and control. And of course, the thing is that I think what the great lesson that the figure Jesus had was that he had direct contact with what you call the divine, whether that's the universe, the God, the Akashic records, or whatever. And he was dangerous to the people of the time, because a lot of organized religions like there to be someone in between. So the people can't talk directly to what they refer to as the divine. They need someone in between, and that's where corruption can be, because maybe you have to pay to talk to the divine, or...
So it's more accessible to have a middleman, a figure who's more human, or human-looking, like Jesus.
That's the story that they give, and I even think that a lot of what was written about Jesus was corrupted as well.
Do you actually believe that Jesus existed?
I believe a Jesus-like character existed, not necessarily of that name, but I think there have been many people who have been you would call divinely inspired, to be educators and to correct society when it's going off track. And I think, for example, Jesus, or the Jesus character, his greatest teaching was that you have the capability to connect directly to the universe or to the divine or whoever, but that made him a threat to the people of the day, and that's why he was murdered. But that's also why the message lives on, is because a lot of what was spoken by him is relevant to this day. How to treat your fellow human being treat I should treat you the way you treat me. I mean, that's a very simple philosophy, but I think it's a universal principle.
Why is it so vital for you to speak about these ancient civilizations and that there were a lot of life before what we know as, factual history?
Well, the thing is, because I see these, especially these stone monuments every day of my life, more or less, and because the general archaeological interpretation, I believe, is wrong, based on bringing stonemasons, geologists, engineers, etc., to look at them, I think it's important that we know or have the ability to know what our true history was, because it's our collective history as human beings.
So we're being deceived or lied to by
Definitely.
Historians or the government, or how deep does it go?
Well, I think all of the above. I think the thing is that with the number of archaeologists, the problem is that when a certain artifact or thing doesn't fit in with their idea, they try to hide it or dismiss it. And again, I think what we should do at this time in the 21st century, because I think a lot of us are looking for personal sovereignty. It's like we want to make our own decisions in a moral and ethical way, that we deserve to be able to look at almost anything and be able to interpret it in a more logical light rather than, and be able to interpret it ourselves, ask different experts what their opinion is, and not depend upon a central source for the truth.
But why do you think they would disinform about these things? What's the agenda behind it?
Well, I think it's control.
Why? Why wouldn't they just say how the actual history was, if it was like what you say?
Well, I think certain governments and certain institutions have put us under certain degrees of control for thousands of years, because it's a way to control society and to structure it the way that these, some elitist people want to have us live. And
because of finances, or is it control? You say, is it like mind control or mass media control, or what?
All of it, actually.
Yeah.
I think, media, government, religion.
But what is it that we're not allowed to know?
Well, I think we have been kept away from our true destiny as who we are, being allowed to learn what it is, who it is that we are to a full extent.
We're being taught that we're descended from the apes,
right?
The monkeys.
Right.
What is your take on that?
Well, actually, my field in university was the biological sciences. And so evolution, Darwinian evolution was in every single aspect of that. And so at one point I did question one of my professors and said, well, what if I question this or have some degree of problem with it? And he said, you will not have a career. So automatically I thought, well, that's control right there. Mm-hmm. And if you study Darwinian evolution, you find out that a lot of what Darwin was talking about was based upon when he lived during the Industrial Revolution. So things like the survival of the fittest and competition was an aspect of society at the time. But that's where being involved with other and older cultures, their perspective is very different. They look at nature and the world as being a growing positive thing, like the relationship of plants with each other tends to be more mutual than it is competition, and so I do have a problem with Darwinian evolution. My mind is open to the idea that we are not necessarily 100% the product of this planet. It is possible others have visited and have influenced our evolution, our DNA. However, that requires the actual DNA testing, which is what we're doing with these people to find out.
So is that really the real secret, possibly, that we came from, another world, so to speak, from another planet, from another race?
It's one of the possibilities. Yeah.
So we're not from the apes.
Well, there's a lot of evidence that it's not such a simple case as what evolution wants to think it is. And again, that takes us back to the cultural phenomenon, because again, evolution is this, or biological evolution is this progression from initially through all these different more complex life forms to apes, and then we are supposed to be the product, the final product at this point of the 21st century of what evolution is. But we make so many mistakes that, of what we're doing to our planet.
We're not that evolved, really.
Oh, no, not at all. And I think some of the ancient cultures were more human than we are, because I think they treated each other in a much more coherent and nice way than what we do. We are at the point now, literally in September of 2013, of the possibility of entering a third world war, which is complete insanity. And what we're
Third World War.
Well,
please talk about that.
Well, some people are saying that we are on the brink of that.
In what way?
In that the scarcity or competition for resources globally has become so heated that you have great powers pushing against each other, literally today. You have the United States and its so-called coalition. You have the Russians and you have the Chinese, and you have these different factions working against each other right now. And some people say that it could reach a point of literally causing us to enter a great, the first great conflict of the 21st century.
How would it start? How would that evolve now, all of a sudden?
Well, no, it's supposedly just been the buildup of all of this tension, and Syria seems to be the flashpoint right now.
So it's the possible war now in Syria that's going to happen, probably.
Well, what they're saying is that it could literally get out of control, and I sincerely hope it doesn't happen.
What do you think is the real story behind the crisis in Syria right now? Do you think it's orchestrated from within?
No, I think it's, I think it's a battle over resources. I think it's a battle for the movement of, for example, petroleum products by different countries who want an economic edge, etc.
A lot of people talk about the New World Order, which is supposedly, the states and the European Union and Russia and all the other continents working together in a more compartmentalized elite, the top of the eye of the pyramid, really. Mm-hmm. So don't you think it's like an orchestrated conflict, that it's really not, it's like man-made, it's not real?
Well, what I can say is that, and this is going back to, the ancient knowledge, etc., some people have used ancient knowledge for selfish reasons. And I'm sure there are people on this planet who communicate with each other, who are very greedy. I hate the term elite, because elite should mean something good, but it is a group of people who are trying to control the resources of the world and the people of the world for their own selfish interest, not necessarily governments, because it's such a complex story. When you have corporations and governments working together on too intimate a level, then you always reach a very dangerous point. But I think, which is a very negative thing, but I think what's happening right now is that people are growing stronger within themselves, and they want personal sovereignty. Of course, they want to obey the laws, but they don't want to be controlled as to who they are and what their destiny is. And I think through things like the internet, etc., we have the possibility of becoming truly a global networking family of people. And I think that's the only way that this planet will survive, is if we all take responsibility for ourselves and what we do to the planet and to each other. And in that way, we can have a very bright future. If we follow down this path of being constantly told what to do, sometimes against our will, then it's going to be very devastating.
But a lot of people seem to be satisfied with being told what to do, really, don't they?
They do.
It's like instilling fear in people and people telling them what to do. It's like very organized and structured, and people kind of like that, don't they?
Yeah, a lot of people like that. Yeah, and
so what should people do to like open their minds to a new possibilities and maybe waking up to their own potential? Do you think people use their full potential?
no, I think most people don't. But it's not my desire, and it's not my responsibility to tell anyone what to do. I can only do what I do in my life, which I think is moral and ethical. If what I do and what I learn can assist people to to find certain aspects of truth within themselves through historical examples, then I think that's excellent. But I don't find myself to be responsible for the lives of others. I can only do what I can. I can't worry about the state of the earth, because that can be too overwhelming.
So please tell us what your research really is. How far does it really go back? I mean, what kind of civilizations are we talking about? How far? How many thousands of years? And before what we have been told in history?
Well, I think right now we're looking at there was a sophisticated global society or civilizations that existed 12,000 years ago. I don't know how much farther back they go, because what we need is...
Was that in Peru or in Egypt or where?
Peru and Egypt and other places. It's more obvious in Peru, Bolivia, and Egypt. In other nations, there are probably structures at least as old, but so many of the buildings have been built on top of the foundations that it would take a lot of work to figure out what's at the base. But because we have such buildings as the Great Pyramids and certain structures in Peru that are by themselves, we are working on the process of actually dating them geologically. And so from that, it's a lifetime process. I don't know how far back we do go. It's just there is building evidence that the end of the last ice age was a dramatic, rapid event, and the stone monuments that exist are telling us that somebody built them, not what conventional archaeology is telling us.
How about Easter Island? How about that? The structures there, the big figures there, the big faces. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I was on Easter Island in November of last year with Dr. Robert Schock. It's about 2,000 miles off the coast of South America. Dr. Schock is a geologist, and because his specialty is water weathering, he was able to redate the Sphinx, the weathering on the Sphinx, at being at least 2,000 years older than what we think of as the pharaonic Egyptians. So therefore, the pharaohs didn't build the Sphinx. And so when we were walking around Easter Island, what most people don't know is the fact that they think it's a series of stone heads, because that's what you see. But Thor Heyerdahl in the 1950s, he and his crew did an excavation of one of them, and they went straight down, and each one is a complete body, at least down to where the navel is.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's underground, or?
The majority, and any of the Easter Island, heads that are up to here, or where the soil is here, each one, more than 900 of them, go straight down.
Really?
And so Dr. Schock believes that it's actually natural weathering and the buildup of sediment that's caused that, and he has no problem to believe that some of these, what are called moai, were created 12,000 years ago.
That's very interesting, yeah.
Well, whereas conventional archaeology says that the Polynesians have lived there for between 1,000 and 2,000 years. This is, many thousands of years prior to their existence on the island.
Wow. How about Stonehenge in Britain? Have you been there? Have you any history about that? That's not what we've been told?
Well, Stonehenge I've been to 3 times, and it's a very beautiful looking thing, but you don't see any precision workmanship like you do in Egypt or Peru or Bolivia, so it was an impressive undertaking. The stone, of course, was supposedly brought from Wales, and it was that stone was specifically chosen to construct Stonehenge. So Stonehenge I find beautiful, but like many of the megalithic works in Europe, I find them interesting, but technologically The only great accomplishment, I think, is the fact that they had to be moved. They were not precision-shaped and interlocked compared to what we see, for example, in Egypt, where you have to literally be there to look at these things. They are mind-blowing.
Yeah, they are. You talked about the red-haired people from Polynesia in Peru. Can you tell us who they were and from what time that they were from?
Yeah, that's actually these people, the Paracas people who died out 2,000 years ago. They're, again, the royal family. They had brown...
So they had royal families even back then?
Oh, sure. But these people had, and because Paracas is a very dry desert, in a lot of cases with the elongated skulls, their hair and skin has been preserved. And so their hair was brownish red. So recently, as in April of 2012, actually no, April of 2013, hair samples were taken to a laboratory in Los Angeles and was shown that the hair is a natural red-brown. And the thing is that most people believe that the Americas, prior to the Europeans and others arriving, the time of Columbus or whatever, that native people all had black hair, very jet black hair. And so
most people on the planet today have black hair, right?
Yeah, they do. But in general, people believe that it was the Native Americans were there first. They came across from Siberia, 15,000 years ago.
So they were actually quite white and red-haired, or?
The Indian people weren't, but this pocket of people, the Paracas, they had this hair, which is brownish red, and you also see it in the tradition, not only in Easter Island, but also Tahiti, Hawaii, and New Zealand. And so the thing is that what we're starting to see is that people were traveling the oceans of the world long before the time of Columbus or the Vikings. And so from the coast of Peru, if you were to try to sail west, the first place you would try to stop at would be Easter Island because it has plentiful water. So it would be a perfect place for people to go and replenish their ships. And then from there you could go to Tahiti. And because we see this ancient bloodline of red-haired people showing up along this pattern of migration, that's definitely a field that I'm working in right now.
So do you think they had a specific type of blood?
It's possible, but again, that's what the DNA analysis...
They talk a lot about bloodlines and O-type negative. And
exactly.
As being like the first or the most, rare blood type, and possibly the first ones on the planet, some researchers say.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That is possible, but that again will require actual analysis, if possible, of 2,000-year-old blood samples and the 2,000-plus-year-old DNA. And it's very complex because DNA, being a human compound, it doesn't last very long before it breaks down.
Right.
That's why it's taken the DNA researchers almost a year so far to process the samples that they have. Because Lloyd Pye, who you may have heard of with the Star Child Skull Project, who I'm in association with, he said that comparing modern DNA...
Is that the crystal skull that we've heard of?
It's actually the Star Child Skull.
Is that different from the crystal skull that we've heard about in myth or...
Well, the Star Child Skull is one specific skull found in Mexico, and there are many characteristics of it which do not appear to be human or ape or anything related to humans or apes. Unfortunately there's only one Star Child Skull.
But humanoid, it's kind of
humanoid
looking but different.
Yeah, but there are something like 25 characteristics, according to Lloyd Pye, which make it not human and also not part of the evolutionary chain. The most obvious example I can think of is that they've analyzed the actual bone material of the Star Child, and Lloyd was trying to take a sample with what's called a Dremel tool or a rotary tool to cut it.
Right.
And the tool, the saw, rotary saw, kept breaking, which was strange. And what he found out afterwards is that the bone material of the Star Child skull is closer to dental enamel than it is bone.
Yeah.
So it's not part of the normal evolutionary chain as we would think of it, because there are no other examples. But also things like the eye sockets are larger, the plate structure of the skull is
So they look
different.
kind of alien or like
Yes.
an extraterrestrial looking being that we've seen on, well, in films and stuff, like Greys or possibly maybe reptilians.
Something like that, yeah, something like that. And the thing is that...
Is that the only one that they found?
It's the only one that's been found and studied by an independent researcher. What I do know is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of strange human-looking skulls which have been found all over the earth.
And they were human.
We don't know. You know, the thing is that I know this person who lived 2,000 years ago was human, but I don't know who her ancestors were. And that's what the DNA testing is all about. Because what we're actually looking for is once the DNA is properly tested, then the samples will be sent to the genetic laboratory in the United States, which has the entire genetic code, you know, decoded basically. It's a bank of computer knowledge that can take a sample of DNA and tell you not only where the ancestry of the person came from, but much more than that.
So it could be like a different type of human type race that lived on the planet, and they found thousands of these type of skulls.
Exactly, and the main point is that once the samples are sent to this laboratory, the computer will automatically compare it to the Native American people of the area, and if there's no match, then the next step you go to is you try to find out where the ancestry comes from, and it could be complex. It could be haplogroups from different parts of the world. That would give us an idea of a migration pattern. And then the more intriguing, if it turns out to be the case, would be that the DNA does not match any known human. So then we're looking at...
So that's the type of information that they don't want to get at, to come out officially, publicly.
Yeah, officially it would be inconvenient, but that's why we're doing it through independent channels.
Because it would be like a disclosure that there are extraterrestrial beings and people from different planetary systems that possibly exist.
Well, what it would tell us initially is it would tell us that there is a type of human that was existing that doesn't fit the pattern that we know of. And then from there, it could get much stranger. I mean, if there are segments of the DNA that do not match anything in the database.
We will not hear about it officially.
You will from me, or
From
those,
you.
or those that are doing the research. Yeah, they will, you know, they will very carefully process the information, and it's not going to be hidden from the world, because it was actually financed. The DNA studies were financed by individuals, and those individuals deserve to know what the information is, and so it will be released one way or the other. It's not my call, but it will be released by the geneticists, because they are very intrigued with the idea. And I think we should be open-minded enough to be able to, once we're presented with the actual data, we should be open-minded enough to be able to look at it and say, okay, well, the history of humanity is not exactly what we've been told. There's another aspect, and that's the evolution of knowledge and consciousness. I mean, it's in our nature to want to know more.
So what do you think people should do to gain more information about these ancient civilizations and what possibly existed many thousands of years before what we've been told?
Well, I think the important first thing is that there are a lot of resources on the internet. You can look at photographs of some of these phenomenal, huge structures. Take into account again that the tools known at the time were not capable of producing them. And then from there, the absolute best thing is, if possible, is to visit these places for yourself and make up your own mind what you're looking at. But that's why I enjoy taking scientists through the sites to look at them and get their interpretation.
What is your best solid evidence that this is actually true and that these civilizations and people lived back then?
Well, it's basically what they left behind, which are the stone buildings. stone walls, stone structures.
Where have you found those stone walls and stone buildings?
A lot of them in Peru, to a lesser degree.
And they were not Inca?
No, the Inca could not have constructed them.
Why not?
Because the Inca, again, had bronze chisels and stone hammers, and bronze is a very soft metal. And the stone they were working was far harder than the actual bronze itself. And the precision of how the walls and other structures were put together without using cement or mortar or glue or any kind of adhesive is so tight that you cannot fit a human hair in between them. And that is probably 20th or 21st century technology. And these are said to have been built at least 1,000 years ago.
Have you written books on the subject?
Yes, I have 13 books so far.
13 books?
Yeah.
And do you have a recent one?
My most recent one actually is about the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines and figures in Peru, because again, they have been attributed either to primitive people on one side or aliens on the other side. And so my book covers all of the theories from one end to the other and looks at a logical solution to them. It's too easy to jump to the idea that ancient aliens or aliens in general were responsible for this work without looking at the idea that humans may have been brilliant enough to be able to do them. Just because we would have a difficult time now interpreting what they are doesn't mean that people 1,000 or 2,000 or more thousand years ago could figure out what was done. There's too much of an idea that we are the most advanced thing that's ever existed, and I think that's arrogant. I'm open-minded enough to believe that, that we are not, this can't be the only intelligent planet in the galaxy or the universe, and that anyone who was 1,000 years ahead of us would have capability beyond our ability to even make a science fiction film about. So cultures even more advanced than that would be well beyond our capacity to comprehend. One thing I've been thinking about recently is that if there were people or beings from other worlds that visited here and had the capability of altering the time-space continuum, I don't even think they would have metallic craft. I think they would be on the level of energy. And so, because the idea...
To be interdimensional?
Well, yeah, exactly. But on levels at least of science fiction, if not beyond our capacity to even imagine. But I think the idea where in almost every science fiction film, it's a metallic craft that travels is our limitation in imagination. I think something like an energy ship of some kind makes more sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something like that we probably wouldn't be able to even see. So they could be
like if time and space doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist in the way that we know it.
Well, in the way that we conventionally look at it, when people say you can't travel faster than the speed of light, it's like, well, you're limiting yourself to one way of looking at it. And that's where books such as Dune was really, I think the reason it was popular and fascinating is that somehow, I think William Herbert was the author, he got to the idea of folds in space. And that's literally where you go from point A to point B.
Like teleportation, right?
Yeah, but in zero time. We're not talking Star Trek where your molecules are altered and moved.
By the power of your mind?
Well, power of your mind and just, the capability to move through space-time instantaneously. So that's where our thoughts of the laws of physics just fall out, is primitive in comparison. But any life form, again, that I think would even be as little as 1,000 years beyond us would be incomprehensible to us. The question is, why would they want to come here? I think there's too much emphasis on...
Why do you think they would want to come here?
Well, it's hard for me to know, but I would think it would be the idea of more adventure than an exploration than the idea of control. I'm open to the idea that there have been life forms come here and alter the history of the planet, but I'm more hopeful that there would be more that would have come here either to assist or simply to observe, or even what the what the prime directive of Star Trek talks about, where you are meant to observe and not influence. But I think it's very small-minded to limit yourself to us as being the intelligent life in the universe, and to look at the laws of physics as being limitations, because those are laws that we understand, and we even call them laws. There are people who are reinterpreting some of these principles of physics and opening up the idea that we still know very little. And I think we should be more modest in the way that we approach everything. We're not the greatest, and I think you learn if you remain as a student. If you think you're the great teacher, then that's the end of your education, and that's foolish.
It's very fascinating. And how can people get more information about your work and find you? Do you have a website?
Yeah, my main website is called hiddenincatours.com, and on that I have different resources, photographs, videos, etc. I have almost 700 videos on YouTube. I publish one about every 4 days because there's so much information. And so that's under my name, Brien Foerster, on YouTube. And through those two resources, there's a lot of information.
The message is coming out.
It is, and I'm working with many different people, which is the great thing. I'm just one piece of the problem solving.
What is your primary message?
Don't limit yourself to what others tell you. Explore for yourself. I think it's mandatory to ask questions in order to develop as a human being, and I think people have, on some level, a responsibility to continue learning up until the day they die or depart. That's the gift we've been given of life. We've been given this experience, so maximize it.
Amazing. Very interesting topic. It's been wonderful hearing about your amazing work, and I want to thank you very much for doing this interview with Age of Truth TV. Brien Foerster, thank you very much.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.